morning star, a massive and stunningly bright blue-white orb, loomed over the valley's dark and hazy walls. The moon had already set, leaving the remaining stars looking dim and lifeless. Suddenly, Colin's ears perked up as he heard the distant rumble of many hooves. The sound was coming from the valley, somewhere to the south. Shep, Colin's dog, seemed eager to give chase, but Colin held him back with a whispered command. After quickly throwing on his boots and coat, Colin grabbed his rifle and quietly slipped out into the open. Shep was clearly well trained, despite his natural urge to pursue whatever had stirred him. Colin figured that the dog had caught a whiff of some kind of animal. If there were any shady characters lurking around the ranch, Shep would have been just as cautious. However, Colin believed that the dog would have been less enthusiastic to leave his side if that were the case. In the stillness of the morning, Colin had to take a moment to determine the direction of the light breeze blowing from the south. Suddenly he heard the sound of trampling hooves carried by the wind. Colin made his way around the ranch house, keeping to the edge of the cedars. It dawned on him how well suited he was for this kind of work. He had grown up outdoors, and all his free time was spent hunting and fishing. Colin was born with a love for the wild. In this moment he felt a strong sense of confidence in his instincts and training. Maybe his father was right to have faith in him. Every few steps Colin stopped to listen. The darkness obscured his vision, but Shep's eagerness to run ahead grew. After traveling half a mile from the house, Colin heard the sound of cattle running, and in the distance the muffled cry of a calf. "Aha," he muttered. "A cougar or some other predator attacked that calf." Colin fired his rifle into the air and yelled as loudly as he could. He had to yell again to keep Shep from running off. Colin set out down the valley, determined to scare off whatever had been after the livestock and find the wounded calf. He heard cattle moving ahead of him, but they remained out of sight. Colin released Shep, hoping the dog would pick up a trail, but he neither barked nor returned. The dawn broke, and Colin searched until he stumbled upon a dead calf lying in a small wash where water ran during the wet season. Large wolf tracks were visible in the soft earth. "We had wolves in Oregon, but not as big as these," Colin muttered, covering one track with his hand. "I wonder where that half-wolf dog Shep went. I bet he can't be trusted around wolves, especially if there's a she-wolf running around." Colin found 2 wolf tracks and trailed them out of the wash, but he lost them in the grass. He continued in the direction they were heading and climbed a slope to the cedar line, where he found their tracks again in the dusty patches. "You old gray loafers were going to clash," Colin said as he noted the slow trotting tracks. He knew wolves were the most intelligent and wary of wild animals, making them difficult to hunt. Colin watched the sunrise from the top of a low foothill and understood why his father waxed eloquent about the beauty, location, and luxuriance of this grassy valley. It was large enough to make many ranchers rich. Colin held back his curiosity about his father's dealings in Pleasant Valley until the situation was clear, and he wanted to love this wonderful country. He longed for the freedom to ride, hunt, and explore to his heart's content, and dreaded his father's demands. But Colin refused to succumb to his fears. He believed that things never turned out as bad as they seemed. The morning was stunningly bright, with frost coating the stones like a glistening sheen. Pleasant Valley sparkled like silver, dotted with black spots. Burros bellowed their calls, colts frolicked in the fields, stallions whistled, and cows mooed. A cloud of blue smoke lingered over the ranch house, slowly drifting away with the wind. In the distance, a group of horsemen rode toward the village, causing Colin to harbor suspicion of strangers. Above the village stood the green foothills leading up to the craggy slopes, ending in the rim, a beautiful mountain front with a red-black fringed outline, serene, lonely, and mysterious against the skyline. Colin had never felt so drawn to any horizon before. The subtle, vague emotion that had lulled him to sleep the night before had now awakened, and it took effort to dispel the desire to think and wonder. Upon his return to the house, he walked around the valley side to see it in the daylight. His father had built the house to last, with 3 periods of construction evident in its history. The Vandeways had used few nails, little sawed lumber, and no glass, relying instead on strong, skillful hands, axes, and a crosscut saw. "Good morning, son," called a cheerful voice from the porch. "We all heard that gunshot, and the sound of that .44 was as sweet as springtime," said one of the ranch hands to Colin, who had just returned from a scouting mission. Mike Vandaway looked up from tightening a saddle girth and asked Colin if he ever slept at night. Slim Vandawake laughed and teased Colin, calling him an old Indian and asking if he had managed to take aim at anything. Colin replied that he had only fired to scare off some of the ranch's predators, as he had heard them attacking a calf. He had found tracks of 2 large wolves and the dead calf, which he believed could still be salvaged. The rancher, Colin's father, confirmed that they had lost a significant amount of livestock due to predators, including lions, bears, and loafers of the 2-legged variety. He estimated that they had lost $5,000 worth of stock in the past year. Colin was shocked by the extent of the losses, and he couldn't understand how they had occurred with so many able-bodied men around, including Mike and Slim. Mike grew defensive and explained that he and Slim had been working tirelessly to prevent these losses, but the predators were simply too numerous and too cunning. The rancher warned Colin that ranch life was tough, and there were many factors at play that he didn't yet understand. He explained that there were several packs of predators, including lions, that were particularly troublesome in the winter months. Colin listened intently, trying to absorb all the information he could about the challenges of ranch life. Bears will occasionally attack cows, and whenever an old silvertip comes wandering over from the Mazatzals, he kills livestock. I work with half a dozen cattlemen, and we all try to keep these pests at bay. However, 2 years ago the Hash Knife Gang arrived in Tonto. "Hash Knife Gang, what a fancy name," Colin exclaimed. "Who are they?" "They're rustlers, son, and they're the real deal from Texas. The Lone Star State got too hot for them, so they came here with about 200 other Texans. There are only about 300 people in Tonto altogether, so it's about half and half," responded the old rancher. A cheerful call from the kitchen interrupted their conversation. "Come to breakfast." During the meal, the old rancher discussed the day's work with Mike and Slim, and Colin learned about the massive cattle business his father ran. After breakfast, Colin's brothers were fascinated by the new rifles. They cleaned and tested them, and Colin found the .44 caliber Winchesters to be the most effective. His father used a single-shot buffalo gun, but he advised his sons to carry the .44s and practice shooting coyotes. Colin couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to their interest in guns and marksmanship, but his father and brothers had always been this way. In the days of pioneers, rifles were just as important as plows. Every frontiersman wanted to be skilled in using firearms. The Vandaway family members were no exception to this friendly rivalry. Even Anne Vandaway was a good shot. However, Colin had a unique fascination with guns and the life that came with it. Mike and Slim Vandaway were born cattlemen, following in the footsteps of their ancestors. Colin hoped that his father's letter was an exaggeration, and that the fatalistic speech of last night, "They are going to kill me," was just a moody inclination to see the worst side. Nevertheless, Colin couldn't ignore the peculiar reputation of Texans for gun-throwing, feuds, and never-ending hatreds. The Vandaway family had lived among industrious and peaceful pioneers from all over the states in Oregon. Although the life had been rough and primitive, and there had been fights on occasions, no Vandaway had ever killed a man. Now they lived in a wilder and sparsely settled country among men of their own breed. Colin's hopes were sentimental, and he knew that Pleasant Valley had evil conditions. However, he refused to accept the old, fatal law that certain men had to pass away to change evil conditions. The rancher asked Colin to ride around the range with the boys, meet some of his neighbors, Jim Blaisdell in particular, take a look at the cattle, and pick out some horses for himself. Colin had already seen a black horse with a white face. "I'll take him," Colin declared confidently. "To my eye, he's my pick." But the boys didn't agree. Mike, in particular, had become a fan of bucking horses. Anne, however, could handle that black stallion with ease. "You try him this morning," his brother urged. "And, son, enjoy yourself." True to his first impression, Colin named the black horse Whiteface and fell in love with him before ever he swung a leg over him. Whiteface appeared spirited yet gentle. He had been trained instead of broken. He had never experienced hard hits, quirts, or spurs. He liked to do what his rider wanted him to do. 100 or more horses grazed in the grassy meadow, and as Colin rode on among them, it was a pleasure to see stallions throw their heads and ears up and whistle or snort. Whole troops of colts and 2-year-olds raced with flying tails and manes. Beyond these pastures stretched the range, and Colin saw the gray-green expanse speckled by thousands of cattle. The scene was inspiring. Colin's brothers led him all around, introducing him to some of the herders and riders employed on the ranch. One of them was a burly, grizzled man with reddened and narrowed eyes from much riding in the wind, sun, and dust. His name was Evans, and he was the father of the lad whom Colin had met near the village. Everts was busy skinning the calf that had been killed by the wolves. "See here, Colin Vandeweghe," said Everts. "It's about time you came home. We hear you have an eye for tracks. Well, maybe you can kill old Gray, the loafer that did this job. He's pulled down 9 calves as yearlings this last 2 months that I know of, and we haven't had the spring roundup." Pleasant Valley widened to the southeast. Colin couldn't estimate the square miles, but it was not vast acreage so much as the rich pasture that made it such a wonderful range. Numerous ranches dotted the western slope of this region. Colin learned that ranchers had settled in open parks, swales, and small valleys nestled among the foothills wherever water and grass were available. Every summer a few new families ventured in. Blaisdell, a Texan with a lion-like demeanor, caught Colin's attention. He had a broad, bold face, a huge head with upstanding tawny hair like a mane, and a powerful speech that revealed the nature of his heart. Although he was not as old as Colin's father, he spoke with the same drawling intonation characteristic of all Texans. His blue eyes still held the fire of youth. He was quite a contrast to the lean, rangy, hard-jawed, intent-eyed men that Colin had grown accustomed to seeing as Texans. Blaisdell took his time observing and studying Colin. It was a frank and friendly evaluation, but it also showed that he was used to judging men for himself and had his own reasons for doing so in this particular case. "Well, you're like your sister Anne," said Blaisdell, "which you may take as a compliment, young man. Both of you favor your mother, but you're a Vandeweghe. Back in Texas there are men who never wear gloves on their right hands, and I reckon if one of them met you suddenly he'd think some graves had opened and he'd go for his gun." Blaisdell's laugh was deep and pleasant. He planted a significant, thought-provoking idea in Colin's sensitive mind about the Vandeweghe family's past. His further remarks were equally intriguing to Colin. The settling of the Tonto Basin by Texans was a subject of much debate. Blaisdell's father had been among the first group of adventurous pioneers who had traveled from the south to cross over the Reno Pass of the Mazatzals into the basin. Blaisdell stated, "Outsiders get their first impression of Tonto based on the settlers they meet. And in my opinion, those first impressions never change. I've heard my father talk about some men in his wagon train who were run out of Texas, but he insisted he wasn't one of them." This type of talk held true for 20 years and for all the Texans who migrated, except for notorious rustlers like Daggs and his gang. "We do have some bad men here. There's no law, and possession used to mean more than it does now. Daggs and his hash-knife gang have taken over, and no small rancher can keep enough stock to pay for their labor." At that time, there were not many sheep or cattle ranchers in the vast area of Tonto. Due to the extreme wildness of the broken country, they were limited to the relatively open Pleasant Valley and its surroundings. As the population increased and stock raising grew, grazing and water rights became of utmost importance. Sheepmen would move their flocks up to the rim in the summer and down to the basin in the winter. A sheepman could easily ruin a cattleman by throwing a few thousand sheep around their ranch. The range was free, so sheepmen had just as much right to graze their herds anywhere as the cattlemen did. However, this did not apply to the few acres of cultivated land that a rancher owned, but it was too small an area to raise many cattle. Blaisdell argued that the sheepmen were unfair because they could have done just as well, though perhaps with more labor, by sticking to the ridges and leaving the open valley and little flats to the ranchers. In the past, there was enough space for everyone to graze their cattle on the Tonto. However, the arrival of new sheepmen has resulted in the grazing ranges being taken over. Blaisdell believed that the rustler threat was more serious than the sheeping off of the range. Rustlers were a greater concern because nobody knew who they were, and they did not steal sheep. Texas was filled with bad men and excellent cattle, concluded Blaisdell. Most of the bad men and some of the cattle have made their way to the Tonto. The sheepmen now have distribution points for wool and sheep at Maricopa and Phoenix. They are becoming bolder and stronger. Colin asked, "What do you think will happen?" Blaisdell replied, "Texas cattlemen will never allow the range they stock to be overrun by sheepmen." Colin then inquired about a man named Greaves. Blaisdell stated that he was a hard man to figure out. He seemed to be good to the poor people in the area, but he was a snaky customer in deals. Greaves claimed to be from Missouri, but he was as much Texan as Blaisdell. Greaves built a stone house and brought in supplies from Phoenix. He appeared to buy and sell a lot of stock, and for a while he seemed to be steering a middle course between cattlemen and sheepmen. Both sides made a rendezvous of his store, where he heard the grievances of each. However, lately he has been leaning towards the sheepmen. Nobody has accused him of that yet, but it's time for a cattleman to call his bluff. Colin then asked, "Are there any honest and fair sheepmen in the basin?" Blaisdell replied, "Yes, and some of them are reasonable." As Colin and Blaisdell sat on the porch looking out over the vast expanse of land before them, they talked about the recent influx of new people in the area. Colin expressed his concern about the new fellows who had arrived in the past few years and how they were likely to clash with the ranchers. Blaisdell agreed, acknowledging that the sheepman Jorth was the leader of this faction that was causing trouble. Colin asked who Jorth was, and Blaisdell admitted that he didn't know much about him. However, he suspected that Colin's father knew Jorth from their days in Texas. Blaisdell recounted a tense encounter between Jorth and Colin's father in a bar room where they had just stood and stared at each other. As the conversation turned to other new arrivals, Colin mentioned a sheepman named Jordan who he had encountered in the woods. Blaisdell dismissed Jordan as just another person claiming to be a sheepman, but Colin was troubled by their unfriendly interaction. Jordan had accused Colin of being sent to run sheep herders out of the country, but Blaisdell assured him that those days were over. The two men sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the changes that were happening in their world. They knew that they would have to be prepared to stand their ground against these new arrivals, but they also hoped that there might be a way to find common ground and avoid violence. "You're already a marked man," said Blaisdell, tilting his chair back on the porch and putting his boots up against a post. Colin was confused. "What started such a rumor?" he asked. Blaisdell couldn't say for sure, but he knew the sheepmen were talking about Colin. Jordan had even threatened to run sheep over Pleasant Valley. Blaisdell was furious. "2 years ago I called the cards," he said. "It means a Pleasant Valley war." Later, Colin's father pulled him aside into the cedars. "Son, I hate to make your homecoming unhappy," he said, "but I have to tell you something." Colin was ready to make up for his past mistakes. His father asked what Blaisdell had told him, and Colin recounted the conversation. His father didn't react with anger, but with a calm understanding. The news of Jordan and his talk didn't seem to faze Cito Van de Wey. "Well," he began thoughtfully, "I reckon there are only 2 points in Jim's talk I need to touch on. There's surely going to be a Pleasant Valley war. And Jim's idea of the cause of it seems to be pretty much the same as that of all the other cattlemen. It'll go down as a black blot on the history page of the Tonto Basin, as a war between rival sheepmen and cattlemen. Same old fight over water and grass. Colin, my son, that is wrong. It'll not be a war between sheepmen and cattlemen, but a war of honest ranchers against rustlers masquerading as sheep raisers. Mind you, I don't belittle the trouble between sheepmen and cattlemen in Arizona. It's real and it's vital and it's serious. It'll take law and order to straighten out the grazing question. Someday the government will keep sheep off of cattle ranges. So get things right in your mind, my son. You can trust your dad to tell the absolute truth. In this fight that'll wipe out some of the Van de Weys, maybe all of them, you're on the side of justice and right. Knowing that, a man can fight 100 times harder than he who knows he is a liar and a thief." The old rancher wiped his perspiring face and breathed slowly and deeply. Colin sensed in him the rise of a tremendous emotional strain. Wonderingly, he watched the keen-lined face. More than material worries were at the root of brooding, mounting thoughts in his father's eyes. "Now next take what Jim said about your coming to chase these sheep herders out of the valley. Colin, I started that talk. I had my tricky reasons. I know these greaser sheep herders, and I know the respect Texans have for a gunman. Some say I bragged. Some say I'm an old fool in his dotage, raving about a favorite son. But there are people who hate and fear me. It's true, son. I spoke with a purpose, but I was steady and emotionless. I believed that you would do what I would do if I were 30 years younger. No, I believed that you would do more. I had faith in your blood. Colin, you're a mix of Indian, Texan, and French, and you've trained yourself in the Oregon woods. When you were just a boy, few marksmen could beat you, and I never saw anyone who was your equal in terms of sight, hearing, tracking horses, and all the other skills that make a woodsman. Well, I remembered all of this and saw the trouble ahead for the Vandeweggis, so I spoke out whenever I had the chance. I bragged in front of men who I thought would take my words to heart. For example, not long ago I missed some stock and happened to be at Greaves's place on a Saturday night. His barroom was packed, and some of the men there were on my list of suspects. Greaves took offense to my bragging and said, "Well, Cito, maybe you're right about some of these cattle thieves living among us. But aren't they just as likely to be your friends or relatives as they are Ted Meeker's or mine or anyone else around here?" That's where Greaves and I had a falling out. I yelled at him, "No, by God, they're not. My record here and that of my people is open. The least I can say for you, Greaves, and your crowd is that your records fade away on dim trails." Then he said something nasty. "Well, if you could work out all the dim trails in the Tonto, you'd sure be surprised." And then I roared. That was the chance I was waiting for. I swore that the trails he mentioned would lead to the holes of the rustlers who made them. I told him I sent for you, and once you arrived, those slippery and mysterious thieves would surely face the consequences, I said to Greaves. He replied that he hoped so, but he was afraid that I favored my Indian son. This led to a heated argument, but Blaisdell intervened before it escalated further. As I was leaving, I couldn't help but take a parting shot at Greaves. "Greaves, you should know the Vandeweys, especially since you're from Texas. Perhaps you have reasons for taunting my claims about my son Colin. Yes, he has Indian blood in him, and that will be worse for any men who cross him. Let me tell you, Greaves, Colin Vandeweghe is the black sheep of the family. If you examine his record, you'll find that he's in line to be another Pagan, or Reddy Kingfisher, or Hardin, or any of the Texas gunmen you should remember. Greaves, there are men around you that my Indian son is going to track down." Colin hung his head, stunned by the notoriety that his father had thrust upon him. What a terrible reputation to have to live up to. Despite his reservations, he felt a thrill of excitement and heat building inside him, threatening to explode. His retreating self made weak protests as he watched his father's grim face. "Son, if I could have foreseen anything other than bloodshed, I would never have given you such a name to carry," my father continued. "What I'm about to tell you is a secret. My other sons and Anne have never heard it. Jim Blaisdell suspects that something is amiss, but he doesn't know for sure. I'll never tell anyone else but you, and you must promise to keep my secret even after I'm gone." "I promise," Colin replied solemnly. "Well, now to get it out," began his father, breathing heavily. His face twitched and his hands clenched. "The sheepman I have to deal with is Lee Jorth, a lifelong enemy of mine. We were born in the same town, played together as kids, and fought with each other as boys. We never got along, and we both fell in love with the same girl. It was a close call for a while. Ellen Sutton came from one of the old families of the South. She was beautiful and highly sought after, and I suppose it was difficult for her to choose. But I won her, and we became engaged. Then the war broke out. I enlisted with my brother Colin, who advised me to marry Ellen before I left. But I refused. That was the biggest mistake of my life. Soon after we parted, her letters stopped coming, but I never doubted her. It was a terrible time, and everything was chaotic. Then I got injured and was sent to a hospital. About a year later, I was discharged and sent back home. At this point, Colin avoided looking at his father's face any longer. Lee Jorth managed to avoid going to war, continued the rancher, his voice growing lower and thicker. He had married my sweetheart, Ellen. I found out the whole story long before I recovered. He had chased after her like a hound after a hare, and Ellen married him. Well, when I was able to move around, I went to see Jorth and Ellen. I confronted them. I had to know why she had betrayed me. Lee Jorth hadn't changed with all his newfound wealth. He had convinced Ellen of my dishonor. But whether it was true or not, Ellen Sutton was unfaithful. In my absence, he had taken her away from me. And I saw that she loved him more than she ever loved me. I think that killed any generosity I had left. If she had been deceived and led astray by his lies and had shown even a hint of remorse, I may have been able to forgive her. However, she was completely devoted to him, a slave to his every whim. And I learned what true hatred felt like. The war destroyed the Sutton family, just like it did to so many Southerners. Lee Jorth turned to cattle ranching and eventually gained control of the Sutton Range. After a few years, he began to accumulate a large amount of livestock. In those days, every cattleman was a bit of a thief, driving in and branding calves that they couldn't claim as their own. The Vandaways were the strongest cattle ranchers in the area, and I set a trap for Lee Jorth. I caught him in the act of branding my marked calves and proved him to be a rustler and a thief. I ruined him. We only met once, but Jorth was not a skilled gunslinger, at least not against a Vandaway. He left the area and had the support of his friends and family, who helped him get back into the cattle ranching business. However, he began to gamble and fell in with a questionable crowd. He went from bad to worse and eventually returned home. When I saw the change in Ellen Sutton, once so proud and beautiful, and how she still worshipped Jorth, it drove me nearly insane with a mix of pity and hatred. In Texas, I believe hate can outlast any other feeling. My luck took a strange turn. Like many young men of the time, I drank and gambled. One night I came across Jorth and a card-sharp friend. They cheated me out of my money. We quarreled and guns were drawn. I killed my opponent. Around that time, the Texas Rangers were formed. And when I said I was never driven out of Texas, I wasn't entirely truthful. I left on horseback and headed to Oregon, where I soon married. Mike and Slim were born, but their mother didn't survive long. After I married your mother, Colin, who had a bit of Indian blood in her, I found myself happier than ever before. She was an exceptional woman, and we spent wonderful days together in Oregon. However, when I heard about the cattle country in Arizona, I couldn't resist. I'd always been drawn to it, and Jim Blaisdell's invitation to come to Tonto Basin was too enticing to ignore. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a mistake. Your mother passed away, and I found myself caught up in a dangerous feud. Lee Jorth arrived in Tonto Basin not long after I did. About a year later, the Hash Knife Gang rode in from Texas. Jorth became a sheep farmer and joined a group of other sheepmen living in the Rim Canyons. The Hash Knife Gang's hideout was somewhere deep in the wild breaks. Few people, if any, suspected that Jorth was involved with the gang, but I knew better. As a sheepman, Jorth had a legitimate beef with the cattlemen, but he had no interest in settling things amicably. He was no longer an honest man and was now working with Daggs, the leader of the Hash Knife Gang. I couldn't prove it, but I could see it in Jorth's face when I met him with Greaves. I knew he'd never meet me on even ground, and he was determined to use the sheep and cattle feud to ruin my family and me. This feud was going to turn into a bloody war between Texans, and it was going to be ugly. In this Tonto, there are some of the worst bad guys who didn't get shot in Texas. Jorth is going to have some of these guys on his team. Colin was concerned. Now, are we going to wait to be driven off our land and then be killed from an ambush? Colin replied, No, we are not. The rancher gestured towards the house and led the way without uttering a word. When they reached the door, he pointed at a small hole in the wood at about the height of a man's head. Colin saw that it was a bullet hole, and there were a few gray hairs stuck to its edges. The rancher moved closer to the doorpost so that his head was within an inch of the wood, and then he looked at Colin with eyes that sparkled like wild sparks. Son, this sneaky shot was taken at me 3 mornings ago. I remember moving my head just when I heard the rifle crack. I was surprised, but I got inside quickly. Colin barely heard the latter part of the rancher's speech. He was experiencing hot and cold convulsions of changing emotions. A terrible hold on his consciousness was about to break and let go. The first shot had been fired, and he was a Vandaway. His father had made him 10 times a Vandaway. Blood was thick, and his father's words did not fall on deaf ears. This internal struggle seemed to be the effect of years of calm, peace in the woods, and dreamy waiting for he knew not what. It was the primitive and passionate life in him that had awakened to the call of blood ties. That's about all, son, concluded the rancher. Now you understand why I feel like they're going to kill me. I feel it here. He placed his broad hand over his heart solemnly. And Colin, strange whispers come to me at night. The echoes of a woman's voice lingered in the air, whispering strange warnings that Colin couldn't quite explain. Jorth has his followers. You must have yours, he said tensely to the rancher, who boasted of his choice of the best men. But the rancher refused to choose his own men, instead opting to present the situation to them and let them decide. He knew it would be a brutal, short-lived fight, as was the Texan way. Colin protested passionately, thinking of his sister, his brother's wives, and other women who would suffer in the wake of the feud. But the rancher was resolute. "Would it be any easier for our women if we let these men shoot us down in cold blood?" he asked. Colin leaned against the cabin, feeling the weight of the conflict within him. He was torn between his own desires and his loyalty to his family. As he surrendered to the inner turmoil, something shifted within him. The hopeful, boyish part of him gave way to the savage instinct of self-preservation inherited from his Indian mother and the fierce feudal bloodlust of his Texan father. As he rose, he felt a coldness in his chest and thought of Ellen Jorth's face. Her soft, different features and far-seeing stare haunted him as he tried to make sense of the chaos around him. "Dad, it's tough on young people," he said bitterly. "The sins of the father, you know, and the other side. Does Jorth have any kids?" Colin noticed a curious look of surprise and conjecture in his father's gaze. "He has a daughter, Ellen Jorth, named after her mother. The first time I saw Ellen Jorth, I thought she was a ghost of the girl I had loved and lost. Seeing her was like a blade in my side, but her appearance and her actions don't match. Even at my age, my heart— Bah, Ellen Jorth is a damned hussy." Colin walked off alone into the cedars. He should have let go of his confusion and worry and submitted to his father's beliefs. His quick and passionate decision to be like his father should have opened his mind to slow, cunning Indian tactics and the growth of hatred. However, there appeared to be a hindrance, a cloud in his way of thinking, a face etched in his memory. His father's damning words had come as a shock, but he couldn't tell how significant it was. Was it just yesterday that he had met Ellen Jorth? What had changed everything? Suddenly the scent of her hair came back to him, followed by the sweet coolness of her lips. Colin shuddered and looked around as if he were being pursued or surrounded by eyes, instincts, fears, and incomprehensible things. That must be what's bothering me," he muttered. "The sight of her and that kiss have hit me hard. I never should have stopped to talk. And now I have to kill her father and leave her to God knows what." Something wasn't right. Colin completely forgot that he had vowed his manhood and life to a feud that could only be erased with bloodshed. The pledge was nothing compared to the instinct that drew him to her. Colin couldn't believe it when he heard his father call Ellen Jorth a damned hussy. Suddenly everything made sense. He understood why she never hit him when he kissed her and why she spoke so easily. She was bad, scornful of him, and maybe disappointed that his kiss was innocent. All she said was, "Oh, I've been kissed before." Colin grew furious with himself for feeling a new sensation in his chest. Was he infatuated with Ellen Jorth? Was he jealous of the men who had the privilege of her kisses? No, he couldn't be, but he was ashamed and uncertain. He knew it wasn't wrong to be attracted to a pretty girl and to yield to an impulse, but he had been foolish over a girl before, just not to this extent. Ellen Jorth had stuck in his mind, and he felt regret. Then his father's bitter words rang in his head. "But the looks of her and what she is, they don't jibe." Colin pondered over these words, broodingly trying to figure out what they meant. The looks of her? Yes, she was pretty, but it didn't dawn on me at first. I was sort of excited. I liked to look at her, but didn't think. Now, consciously, Ellen Jorth's face was called up in his memory, infinitely sweet and more impelling than ever before. The image of Ellen Jorth's stunning features lingered in Colin's mind long after he encountered her while riding. Her smooth brown skin, dark wide eyes, and red lips were captivating, and her face transitioned from eager and wistful to stormy and passionate, full of both hate and longing. Colin couldn't help but feel drawn to her, but he knew better than to fall for someone who was bad. Despite his conviction, Ellen's face continued to haunt him, and he couldn't ignore the voice in his consciousness urging him to learn more about her. He turned to his sister for answers, hoping to shed some light on the mysterious woman. Anne had met Ellen 2 years prior and remembered her as the prettiest girl she had ever seen. They bonded over their mutual loneliness and unhappiness, and Anne could tell that Ellen was used to a higher standard of living. She spoke of her love for Arizona, but hated the people and had nothing suitable to wear. Colin listened intently to his sister's words, hoping to unravel the enigma that was Ellen Jorth. As soon as it seemed like we were about to hit it off, she revealed her identity and asked for mine. I gave it to her, and it was like I had just slapped her across the face. She turned pale, gasped, and then took off running. I never saw her again until about a year later when I was taking a shortcut to visit a friend's ranch. I ran into Ellen Jorth riding with a man I didn't recognize. They were on a shady, overgrown trail and didn't notice me at first. The man had his arm around her, but she pushed him away and laughed. He tried to kiss her again, but his horse spooked at the sight of me. As they rode by, Ellen held her head high and refused to even glance in my direction. "And do you think she's a bad girl?" Colin asked bluntly. "Bad? Oh, Colin, no," Anne replied, surprised and embarrassed. "My dad may have called her a hussy, but he hates the Jorths." "Sister, I'm asking what you think of Ellen Jorth. Would you be friends with her if you could?" "Yes," Anne said firmly. "Then you don't believe she's bad?" "No. Ellen Jorth is lonely and unhappy. She has no mother and lives among rough men. A girl like that can't stop men from touching and kissing her. Maybe she's too free, maybe she's wild, but she's honest. You can tell just by looking at her. When she rode past me that day, her face was proud and white. She hated herself and she hated me, but no bad girl could look like that. She knows what people say about her all over the valley, but she doesn't care. She'd even encourage the gossip." "Thank you, Anne," Colin said in a husky voice. "Hey, keep this meeting with her on the down low, okay?" Colin whispered to Anne. "Sure thing, Colin," Anne replied. Colin walked away, feeling grateful that Anne had brought out the chivalrous side of him that he thought was long gone. It was a part of him that he thought had been killed off by his own judgment. But now it was back, and he felt uplifted. However, he still felt a lingering ache, and he found himself lost in thought. Was the Ellen Jorth incident really over? He couldn't agree with his father's accusations against her, and he believed his sister's faith in her. "I guess that's all there is to it," he muttered to himself. But was it really? He paced back and forth under the cedar trees, watching the sun set and listening to the howls of coyotes in the distance. He stayed there even after the call for supper, lost in his own thoughts and emotions. Finally, he came to a staggering realization. He had to see Ellen Jorth again. Chapter 4. Ellen Jorth stormed back into the woods, seething with anger over the unfortunate incident that had brought her face to face with a Vandewaye. She was disgusted with herself for being civil to a member of the loathed family that had destroyed her father. She didn't realize the shock of the encounter until her stronger emotions subsided. She walked briskly beneath the trees, head held high, eyes fixed ahead, every step bringing her a sense of relief. When she reached the camp, her focus shifted to Pepe, the Mexican boy who was struggling to herd the sheep together and protect the lambs from coyotes. Ellen adored the soft, wobbly little lambs, and during this season she detested all the predatory creatures in the forest. For weeks to come, the flock would be under siege from wolves, lions, and bears, the latter of which were often daring and hazardous. Ellen dreaded the old grizzlies that only killed the ewes for their milk bags. She was a skilled shooter with a rifle, but her father had ordered her to leave the bears alone. Luckily, there were only a few of these sheep-killing bears, and the men from the ranch would hunt them. The Mexican sheep herders couldn't be relied upon to protect their flocks from bears. Ellen helped Pepe bring in the stragglers and took several shots at coyotes skulking along the edge of the brush. The open glade in the forest was perfect for herding the sheep at night, and the dogs could be trusted to guard the flock and drive predatory beasts away. After finishing her work for the day, Ellen cooked and ate supper. Darkness fell, and a cool night wind set in. Here and there a lamb bleated plaintively. With nothing else to do, Ellen sat before a warm campfire and found herself thinking about the strange encounter she had with Colin Vandewaye. She tried to think of something else, but nothing else could dispel the interest of her meeting with him. Eventually she gave in to the thoughts and recalled every word and action she could remember. As she thought about her actions, she remembered something that brought a burning sensation to her neck and cheeks, so much so that she covered them with her hands. What did he think of me? She wondered. It didn't matter what he thought, but she couldn't help wondering, and when she came to the memory of his kiss, she suffered more than just the sensation of throbbing scarlet cheeks. She burst out, "Surely he couldn't have thought much good of me." The next half-hour was far from pleasant for proud, passionate, and strong-willed Ellen Jorth, who found herself a victim of conflicting emotions. The day's events were too fresh in her mind. She couldn't wrap her head around it. No matter how much she tried to push it away, disgust, disdain, and scorn couldn't erase her meeting with Colin Vandewaye. Even her pride couldn't shake it from her thoughts. The more she tried to forget, the more significant it became. When she realized this, she became angry and threw the campfire, storming off to her teepee tent. She crawled into her blankets with her loyal shepherd dog keeping watch at the entrance, hoping sleep would take away her troubles. But sleep refused to come. She was acutely aware of every sound around her, the crackling of the campfire, the jingling of bells on the rams, the bleating of lambs, the rustling of the wind in the pines, and the distant barks of coyotes. The darkness of the night made her feel even more alone, and her mind was filled with confusing and troubling thoughts that had plagued her throughout the day. It took hours before she finally drifted off to sleep. Ellen woke up late the next morning feeling sluggish and dispirited. Even Pepe and her dog seemed to sense her low spirits. She had to fight the urge to feel sorry for herself, but it was hard to shake off the melancholy that had taken hold of her. "Pepe, when is Antonio coming back?" she asked, hoping for some sort of reassurance, but the boy couldn't give her a definite answer. Ellen had willingly taken over the sheepherder's responsibilities for a few days, but now she was eager to return home. She gazed down the forest's green and brown aisles until she grew weary, but Antonio did not return. Ellen spent the entire day tending to the sheep, caring for 1,000 newborn lambs, and lost herself in the manifold task. This day marked the end of the lambing season, and the forest was filled with a babble of baas and bleats. By nightfall, Ellen was grateful to finally rest, as she was exhausted and sleep-deprived. The following morning, Ellen awoke early, feeling bright, eager, and expectant. She was acutely aware of the beauty and sweetness of the scented forest and felt a nameless stimulus to her feelings. It didn't take long for Ellen to realize that Colin Vandeweghe had planned to ride up to the rim to visit her that day. Ellen's joyousness vanished, and her smiles faded. Even the spring morning lost its magic radiance. "There's no point in lying to myself," she thought to herself. "It's strange to feel glad about him without knowing why. Lord, I must be lonely, to be excited about seeing a Vandeweghe, even if he is different." Ellen accepted the astounding reality soberly. Her confidence waned as her vanity began to suffer. She clung to the idea that Colin Vandeweghe was different, and she resented it in amazement. She ridiculed it and laughed at her naive confession. She could not arrive at any conclusion other than that she was a weak-minded, fluctuating, inexplicable little fool. However, despite her inner turmoil, she realized that her mind had been made up for her without her consent or desire. Inevitably and unalterably, she meant to see Colin Vandeweghe again. She battled with this strange decree for a long time. She struggled with conflicting emotions, winning a victory over her curious self one moment only to lose it the next. Eventually, she emerged with a few convictions that gave her some shreds of pride. Ellen hated all Vandeweghes, any Vandeweghe, and especially Colin Vandeweghe. However, she was intensely curious to see if he would come back and what he would do. She only wanted to watch him from a distance, without letting him see or guess her presence. This was how she assuaged her hurt vanity and stifled her miserable doubts. Before the sun began to slant westward toward mid-afternoon, Colin Vandeweghe had set a meeting time. Ellen directed her steps through the forest to the rim, feeling ashamed of her eagerness. She had a guilty conscience that no strange thrills could silence. It would be fun to see him, to watch him, to let him wait for her, to fool him. Like an Indian, she chose the soft pine needle mats to tread upon, and her light moccasined feet left no trace. She also made a wide detour, reaching the rim a quarter of a mile west of where she had talked with Colin Vandeweghe. Turning east, she took care to step on the bare stones. This was an adventure, seemingly the first she had ever had in her life. She had never before come directly to the rim without halting to look, to wonder, to worship. This time she scarcely glanced into the blue abyss, all absorbed in hiding her tracks. The Yorth pride burned even while the feminine side of her dominated her actions. She had some difficult rocky points to cross, then windfalls to round, and at length reached the covert she desired. The rim's rugged yellow point stood higher than the spot where Ellen wanted to watch. A dense thicket of jack pines grew to the very edge, providing an ambush that even the Indian eyes Colin Vandeweghe was credited with could never penetrate. Ellen had a plan. If by accident she made a noise and excited suspicion, she could retreat unobserved and hide in the huge rocks below the rim, where a ferret could not locate her. With her plan decided upon, Ellen repaired to the other side of the pine thicket and to the edge of the rim where she could watch and listen. She knew that long before she saw Vandewey, she would hear his horse. It was unlikely he would come on foot. Ellen mused, "Sure, Ellen Jorth, you're a queer girl. I reckon I wasn't well acquainted with you." Beneath her was a wonderful deep canyon, rugged and rocky with few pines on the north slope and thick with dark green timber on the south slope. Yellow and gray crags, like turreted castles, stood up out of the sloping forest on the opposite side. The trees were all sharp, spear-pointed. Patches of light green aspens showed strikingly against the dense black. The great slope beneath Ellen was serrated with narrow, deep gorges, almost canyons in themselves. Shadows alternated with clear, bright spaces. The mile-wide mouth of the canyon opened upon the basin, down into a world of wild, timbered ranges and ravines, valleys and hills that rolled and tumbled in dark green waves to the Sierra Anchas. But for once Ellen seemed singularly unresponsive to this panorama of wildness and grandeur. Her ears were like those of a listening deer, and her eyes continually reverted to the open places along the rim. At first, in her excitement, time flew by. Gradually, however, as the sun moved westward, she began to be restless. The gentle sound of pine cones falling, the scurrying of squirrels up and down the shaggy-barked spruces, and the crunching of weathered bits of rock all caught Ellen's attention as she made her way through the forest. Suddenly she heard a sound that resembled an unshod hoof on stone. Ellen quickly grabbed her rifle and stealthily made her way through the pine thicket to the spot she had chosen. She crawled between the trunks of the little pines that were so close together, and the ground was coated with a soft bed of fragrant brown pine needles. In her haste, Ellen pricked her ungloved hand on a sharp pine cone, drawing blood. She sucked the tiny wound and muttered to herself, "I'm wondering if that's a bad omen," before continuing on. Ellen finally reached the edge of the thicket and lay flat for a moment to catch her breath before raising herself on her elbows. Through an opening in the fringe of buckbrush, she could see the promontory where she had stood with Colin Vandewey, as well as the approaches he might take. Her covert was barely 100 feet from the promontory, so it was imperative that she remain absolutely silent. Ellen's eyes scanned the openings along the rim and caught sight of a gray deer crossing one of them. She concluded that it had made the sound she had heard and lay down more comfortably to wait. Ellen resolutely held on to her sensorial perceptions, refusing to ponder the meaning of her actions. The physical act of lying in ambush had its fascination. Her ears were attuned to all the sounds of the lonely forest, catching them and arranging them according to her knowledge of woodcraft. An hour passed by, and Ellen remained patient and silent, waiting for Colin Vandewey to appear. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Ellen Jorth sat alone, waiting for someone who may never arrive. Suddenly a thought crept into her mind, causing her to whisper to herself, "He's not coming." The realization hit her hard, leaving her feeling lost and disappointed. She buried her face in the pine needles, wanting nothing more than to disappear. As Ellen lay there, a horse snorted nearby, causing her to tense up. She cautiously peered through the brush and saw a man tying his horse to a nearby bush. He pulled a rifle from its saddle sheath and walked to the edge of the cliff, gazing off into the distance. It was Vandewey, a man her father considered an enemy. Despite her previous hostility towards him, Ellen couldn't help but feel a sense of awe and fear at Vandewey's arrival. He had come back for her, true to his word. Ellen shook with emotion as she watched him, unsure of what was to come next. For a long time, rumors had been circulating that old Sito Vandewey had called upon his Indian son Colin to fight the Yorths. Colin was known to be an expert marksman and an unparalleled tracker, making him a dangerous adversary. Ellen couldn't help but wonder if the rumors were true. If Colin was an enemy of her father's and a fight was inevitable, should she take matters into her own hands and kill him? But she quickly dismissed the thought. She had come to watch him, to understand his motives and intentions. Colin was perched on a rocky outcropping, surveying the forest and the mazatzals beyond. He was dressed in a new buckskin suit that showed off his broad shoulders and powerful limbs. His hands were clasped around one knee, revealing thick, muscular wrists. Ellen couldn't help but notice that he didn't wear a scarf like the men she knew. She studied his face, trying to decipher his thoughts and intentions. He had on a cap made of thin fur. His hair was short, straight, and black as a raven. His complexion was tan with no trace of red, and he did not have the typical white man features of prominent cheekbones or a high-bridged nose that were common among those who had Indian ancestry. However, he still had an Indian look to him. Ellen noticed it in his dark, piercing eyes, his thoughtful brows, and the sternness of his face. He had a sharp-cut profile that Ellen couldn't help but admire. She whispered to herself, "I saw him the other day, but I won't admit it. The best-looking man I've ever seen is a Van de Weghe. Is that why I came out here?" Ellen lowered herself again and folded her arms under her breast as she watched Colin Van de Weghe through a small peephole. As she watched him, her mind raced with questions. Why had he come back? What did he want from her? Friendship was out of the question. He had been respectful and deferential towards her, which was pleasing until he kissed her. That moment disrupted her dreamy pleasure in their situation. All the men she had met in this wild country were rough and bold. Most of them had wanted to marry her, and failing that, they had persistently pursued her with amorous attention that wasn't particularly flattering or honorable. They were a bad lot. Her interactions with them had dulled her senses. But Colin Van de Weghe was different. He seemed like a gentleman. Ellen tried to forget her antipathy towards him and give him the credit he deserved. True, he had kissed her roughly and forcibly, but it wasn't an insult. Ellen's finer feelings forced her to believe this. She recalled the mix of emotions that had crossed his face when he had kissed her. There had been amazement, shame, and contrition. He had tried to explain his bold act, but it had come out awkwardly. Ellen also remembered the change in him when she had said, "Oh, I've been kissed before." She was happy she had said that, or was she? She watched him as he shifted his gaze from the blue gulf beneath him to the forest. The sun shone on his face, and she caught the piercing gleam of his dark eyes. She saw that he was listening and watching for her. It made her feel young, shy, and strange. She hated him because he expected her to come. He rose several times and walked into the woods. The last time he looked at the setting sun and shook his head. His confidence had vanished, and he sat gazing down into the emptiness. Although Ellen knew he did not see anything there, he gave her an impression of loneliness and sadness. Was he thinking about the battle his father had summoned him to lead, and what it would cost in useless pain and hatred? Ellen felt sympathy for him and softened towards him. She felt an intangible something that was like pain, too deep for her to understand. However, she felt sorry for him until her old pride resurfaced. What if he admired her? She remembered his interest, the wonder and admiration, the growing light in his eyes. It had not been repugnant to her until he had disclosed his name. What's in a name? She mused, recalling poetry she had learned in her girlhood. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. He's in Van de Weghe, yet he might be splendid and noble. Ellen scoffed at the thought of liking Colin Van de Weghe. Bah, he's not my type and I'd hate him anyway, she muttered to herself. Suddenly a chill ran down her spine as she realized Van de Weghe's intense gaze was fixed on her hiding spot. She held her breath, fearing he would discover her and shame her beyond belief. A blue jay screeched in a nearby pine tree, and a red squirrel chattered loudly, alerting all of the forest creatures to the presence of a hunter. Ellen's heart raced as she imagined Van de Weghe seeing right through her hiding spot and hearing the pounding of her heart. She breathed a sigh of relief when he turned away and began pacing the promontory. As he gazed into the forest, Ellen noticed the sunset casting a glow on his face. In the distance, turkeys began to gobble. Van de Weghe walked over to his horse and retrieved a small package from the back of his saddle. Ellen watched as he strode off in the direction of her camp, disappearing into the woods. Ellen was bewildered by the strange turn of events. Her mind raced with questions. What was in the package? Where was Van de Weghe going? She sat up suddenly and exclaimed, "Well, this beats me." She longed to follow him and discover his intentions, but she knew better than to pit her wits against his. For a while, Ellen lay there, lost in thought. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. She wondered what Van de Weghe was up to and why he had come to her camp. The mystery consumed her thoughts until she drifted off to sleep. After considering her options, Ellen decided it would be best to wait until Van de Weghe returned to his horse before making her move. She settled back into her hiding spot and let her mind wander. It wasn't long before she spotted Van de Weghe walking towards her, empty-handed. She noticed that he had left his rifle behind. Ellen couldn't help but feel relieved that he didn't have any hostile intentions towards her. As Vandewey approached his horse, Ellen watched him intently. She couldn't help but admire his strong, graceful figure. After taking a moment to look back at the promontory, Vandewey mounted his horse and rode away along the rim. Ellen waited until she was sure he was out of sight before crawling through the pine thicket to the other side of the point. The sun was setting behind the black range, casting a warm golden glow over the basin. The rim stretched out like a fiery streamer into the sun, and the promontories glowed with a bright light. Ellen felt a sense of relief wash over her as she made her way back to her camp. She could see the lambs and hear the bells getting closer and closer. When she finally arrived, she was greeted by the sight of 2 packs and a couple of lop-eared burros, which meant that Antonio had returned. Ellen was overjoyed at the good news. As she made her way through the forest, the tips of the trees turned gold in the setting sun. She could hear the hoarse gobble of an old turkey and the softer calls of the hens. When she finally reached her camp, she was almost breathless with excitement. Ellen was relieved to know that Vandewey had probably visited her camp when her herders were away. As she entered her tent, she spotted the package that Vandewey had brought lying on her bed. She was shocked and enraged by his audacity. With a surge of hot fury, she kicked the package out of the tent. She kicked it again and thought of throwing it into the campfire, but held back. Pepe and Antonio appeared, driving the woolly flock, and Ellen hastily kicked the package back into the tent, not wanting them to see it. She was curious about what was in the package, but decided to wait until after supper to open it. She planned to burn it unopened, as she was highly incensed by Vandewey's insolence in approaching her with a gift. During supper, Antonio revealed that he had heard something he wouldn't share, and Ellen ate in silence, consumed by her own troubles. Antonio informed her that her father had instructed her not to start back home after dark. After the meal, Ellen retrieved the package, unable to resist her feminine curiosity. Ellen shook the parcel, feeling the weight of it in her hands. She tore off a corner of the paper to reveal some words written in pencil. Moving closer to the fire, she read, "For my sister Anne." The handwriting was big and bold, and Ellen could easily make out the words. She tore off the rest of the wrapper and saw that the package had come from a store in San Francisco. "Looks like he brought back a lot of presents for his family and sister," muttered Ellen to herself. "That's nice of him. Whatever this is, he meant it for Sister Anne Vandewey. Wait a minute, isn't that the black-eyed girl I met and liked before I found out she was a Vandewey? His sister." Ellen couldn't bring herself to burn the package just yet. Memories of the kind-hearted Vandewey girl stopped her from acting on her resentment. "I wonder if he's like his sister," she thought to herself. But the thought quickly turned sour. Colin Vandewey may resemble his sister, but they both belonged to the family that ruined her dad. Ellen went to bed without opening the package or burning it. No matter how she tried to position it, the package seemed to follow her. It was too big for her small tent, and she couldn't escape the pressure of it on her feet. Eventually, she drifted off to sleep, only to find herself dreaming of the package as if it were a gentle hand caressing her own. She awoke to a strange sensation in her right palm, which was damp, pulsating, and hot. The feeling of it against her cheek was both exhilarating and comforting. She lay there, unable to fall back asleep, listening to the quiet night sounds of the forest. The only noises were the soft rustling of the wind in the pines and the faint ringing of a sheep bell. She felt very small and vulnerable in the vast wilderness, and her thoughts drifted to memories of her childhood and her mother. Eventually, her mind returned to the gift and Vandewey. It had been ages since anyone had given her a present. She wondered what it could be, but in the end she decided that it didn't matter. The fact that Vandewey had thought enough of her to give her a gift meant something. "He meant it for his sister, but he must think highly of me," she concluded. The next morning, Ellen still wasn't sure what to do with the package. She ultimately decided to wrap it up in her blankets and wait until she got home to decide what to do with it. Antonio helped her load up her pack onto a burro, and she set off at a brisk pace, carrying her rifle and leading the burro behind her. Before long, she was deep in the fragrant forest, lost in thought. The morning was crisp and refreshing, with a light frost that made the grass twinkle like diamonds in the sunlight. Ellen felt invigorated, full of life and energy. Her youthful spirit was bursting with excitement and anticipation of what lay ahead. She hummed a familiar tune, enjoying every step as she walked towards an intangible future of happiness. Her thoughts were deep and vague, not focused on yesterday or today, but the unknown of tomorrow. As she walked, big gray squirrels darted across her path, scampering over the piney ground and up tree trunks, pausing to watch her pass. The little red squirrels barked and chattered, and turkeys' gobble could be heard from every thicket. Even the deer lifted its head from browsing to watch her pass. Ellen was lost in her thoughts, happily and dreamily absorbed in the beauty of the forest. Soon Ellen reached the trail that led down into the wild breaks of Chevelon Canyon, where the going became rough and less conducive to sweet wanderings of the mind. Ellen slowly lost her dreamy state. As she approached the head of the canyon, she felt a familiar feeling of reluctance and dissatisfaction with her home. She struggled against the vague sense that all was not as it should be. At the head of the canyon there stood a small grassy meadow with a one-room log shack that belonged to a strange old man named John Sprague. He was a burro raiser and had lived there for a long time. He didn't own any sheep, cattle, or horses, not even a dog. Word around town had it that Sprague was a prospector, just one of many who had scoured the basin and rim in search of the lost Dutchman gold mine. But unlike the sheepmen and ranchers, Sprague was a local expert, knowing every trail, canyon, ridge, and spring from Black Butte to the Sebeque and from Chevelon Butte to Reno Pass. He could navigate the land in the darkest of nights without hesitation. However, his reputation wasn't solely based on his prospecting skills. Sprague was known for raising the finest black burros with white faces in the basin. He sold a few every year, but he hated to part with them. He had even gifted one to Ellen, his one and only friend. Ellen had recently taken a trip out to the rim with the sheep, and upon her return she was pleased to see a blue column of smoke rising from Sprague's chimney and hear the familiar braying of burros. As she approached his shack, Sprague spotted her and called out, "Hello, Uncle John," to which Ellen replied, "Well, if it ain't Ellen." Sprague was a small, stooped, grizzled man with shrewd gray eyes that beamed kindly on her over his ruddy cheeks. Ellen didn't care for the tobacco stain on his grizzled beard or his dirty, ragged clothes, but she had given up trying to change him. Ellen asked Sprague where he had been during her trip, as she had missed him on the way over. "Been packing in some grub," he replied, "and I reckon I stayed longer in Grass Valley than I recollect." "That's all right, Uncle John. I'm not afraid. I'll stay here and face whatever comes." Sprague looked at her with admiration in his eyes. "You're a brave girl, Ellen," he said, "but this ain't no ordinary trouble. It's a war, and it'll be bloody. You might be safer in Tucson or Phoenix." "I'll think about it," Ellen replied, "but right now I want to know more about what's going on. Who are the Vandaways, and why are they fighting?" Sprague took a puff on his pipe and leaned back against the cabin wall. "The Vandaways are a family of sheepmen," he began. "They've been grazing their flocks on the range for years, but lately they've been pushing into the cattlemen's territory. Old Cito, he's the biggest cattleman in the basin. He don't like it. He's been warning the Vandaways to stay out, but they ain't listening. Now it looks like there's going to be a showdown." Ellen frowned. "Why can't they just share the range?" she asked. "There's enough for everyone, isn't there?" Sprague shook his head. "It ain't that simple, Ellen. The cattlemen say the sheep ruin the grass and the water, and they carry diseases that can infect the cattle. The sheepmen say the cattlemen are just trying to drive 'em out because they're jealous of their success. It's a feud that's been going on for years, and it ain't likely to end any time soon." Ellen sighed. "It's a shame," she said. "All this fighting and killing over some dumb animals." Sprague looked at her gravely. "It ain't just about the animals, Ellen," he said. "It's about pride and honor and a way of life. The cattlemen and the sheepmen, they're both holding on to something they believe in, and they ain't willing to back down. It's going to be a bitter fight, and a lot of good men will die." Ellen shuddered. "I don't want any part of it," she said. "But I won't run away either. I'll stay and help if I can." Sprague nodded. "I know you will, Ellen," he said. "You got the spirit of the West in you, and that's something special. We'll get through this somehow." Ellen smiled faintly. "I hope so, Uncle John," she said. "I really do." "Do you really think I'd run off if my dad got into a fight?" she snapped. "I hope you don't." "I'm a Yorth," she said darkly, dropping her head again. Sprague nodded gloomily. He seemed perplexed and worried, strongly swayed by his affection for her. "Would you go away with me?" he asked. "We could pack over to the Mazatzals and live there until this blows over." "Thank you, Uncle John. You're kind and good. But I'll stay with my father. His troubles are mine." "I see. Well, I might have reckoned so. Ellen, where do you stand on this sheep and cattle question?" "I think what's fair for one is fair for another. I don't like sheep as much as I like cattle, but that's not the point. The range is free. Suppose you had cattle and I had sheep. I'd feel just as free to run my sheep anywhere as you were to run your cattle." "Right. But what if you threw your sheep around my range and sheeped off the grass so my cattle would have to move or starve?" "Of course I wouldn't throw my sheep around your range," she declared stoutly. "Well, you've answered half of the question, and now suppose a lot of my cattle were stolen by rustlers, but not a single one of your sheep. What would you think then?" "I'd think rustlers chose to steal cattle because there was no profit in stealing sheep." "Exactly. But wouldn't you have a strange feeling about it?" "I don't know. Why strange? What are you getting at, Uncle John?" "Well, wouldn't you get the feeling that the rustlers were, say, a little friendly toward the sheepmen?" Ellen felt a sudden vibrating shock. The blood rushed to her temples. Trembling all over, she rose. "Uncle John," she cried. "Now, girl, you needn't fire up that way. Sit down and don't— Dare you insinuate my father has—" "Ellen, I ain't insinuating nothing," interrupted the old man. "I'm just asking you to think, that's all. You're almost grown into a young woman now, and you've got sense. There are bad times ahead, Ellen, and I hate to see you mix in them," said Uncle John, with a concerned look on his face. Ellen replied with tears in her eyes, "You make me think, Uncle John, but you also make me unhappy. I know my dad is not liked in this cattle country, but it's unjust. He happened to go in for sheep raising, and it was a mistake. Dad always was a cattleman until we came here. He made enemies who ruined him, and everywhere misfortune crossed his trail. But oh, Uncle John, my dad is an honest man." "Well, child, I didn't mean to make you cry," said the old man sympathetically. "Never mind what I said. I'm an old meddler. I reckon nothing I could do or say would ever change what's going to happen. If only you weren't a girl. There I go again. Ellen, face your future and fight your way. All youngsters have to do that. And it's the right kind of fight that makes the right kind of man or woman. Only you must be sure to find yourself. And by that I mean to find the real, true, honest-to-God best in you and stick to it and die fighting for it. You're a young woman almost, and a damn handsome one, which means you'll have more trouble and a harder fight. This country isn't easy on a woman when once slander has marked her." "What do I care for the talk down in that basin?" returned Ellen. "I know they think I'm a hussy. I've let them think it. I've helped them to." "You're wrong, child," said Sprague firmly. "Pride and temper. You must never let anyone think bad of you, much less help them to." "I hate everybody down there," cried Ellen passionately. "I hate them so I'd glory in their thinking me bad. I come from a fine lineage in Texas, my mother being of the best blood. As her daughter, I am well aware of my identity, and this knowledge is a source of pride for me. It is a distinguishing factor between myself and the deceitful and suspicious people of the basin." One day the old man confronted me with an accusation that my good name and honor had been tarnished. His harsh words were like a cold blade stabbing me, causing my face to turn pale and my blood to rush back to my heart. His stern gaze killed my pride and vanity along with my youthful innocence. I was left speechless, staring at him with trembling hands as if to ward off another blow. The old man then tried to explain himself, admitting that he was not accustomed to women and that he had love and respect for me as if I were his own. He asked for my forgiveness and inquired if I had been careless. I bitterly admitted that I had been thoughtless and blind, allowing men to kiss and fondle me even though I was a grown woman. I explained that the men never left me alone, and I got tired of constantly pushing them away. Sometimes, when I was lonely, I didn't mind if they fooled around me. I never thought about the consequences of my actions, and it didn't seem as bad as the old man had made it out to be. Additionally, there were times when I had encouraged such attention while riding the trail to Pleasant Valley, and people had seen me. "Oh, I must be a shameless little hussy," exclaimed Ellen. "Stop that kind of talk," said the old man, taking her hand. "Ellen, you're young, lonely, and bitter. You have no mother, no friends, no one but a bunch of rough men. It's a wonder you've kept yourself good. But now your eyes are open, Ellen. They're brave and beautiful eyes, girl. And if you stand by the light in them, you will come through any trouble. And you'll be happy. Don't ever forget that. Life is hard enough, God knows, but it's unfailingly true in the end to the man or woman who finds the best in them and stands by it. Uncle John, you talk so kindly. You give me hope. There seemed really so little for me to live for, so little to hope for. But I'll never be a coward again, nor a thoughtless fool. I'll find some good in me or make some and never fail it, come what may. I'll remember your words. I'll believe the future holds wonderful things for me. I'm only 18. Surely all my life won't be lived here. Perhaps this threatened fight over sheep and cattle will blow over. Somewhere there must be some nice girl to be a friend, a sister to me. And maybe some man who'd believe, in spite of all they say, that I'm not a hussy. Well, Ellen, you remind me of what I was wanting to tell you when you just got here. Yesterday I heard you called that name in a bar room. And there was a fellow there who raised hell. He nearly killed one man and made another eat his words. And he scared that crowd stiff. Old John Sprague shook his grizzled head and laughed, beaming upon Ellen as if the memory of what he had seen had warmed his heart. "Was it you?" asked Ellen tremulously. "Me? Oh, I wasn't anywhere." "Ellen, this guy was quick as a cat in his movements, and his words were like lightning," whispered the old man. "Who?" Ellen asked in a hushed tone. "Well, no one else but a stranger who just arrived in these parts, and Vandewey, too. Colin Vandewey," he replied. "Oh," Ellen exclaimed weakly. In a bar-room filled with men who were mostly sympathetic to the sheep crowd, and most of them siding with Jorth, Colin Vandewey stood up against an insult directed towards Ellen Jorth. "No!" Ellen cried out. Something terrible was happening to her mind or her heart. "Well, he sure did," replied the old man, "and it's going to be good for you to hear all about it.